Tara, welcome and thank you very much for doing this. Now you're in New Mexico, is that correct?
I am. And thank you guys for having me.
Sure. Well, for you guys on YouTube, this is streaming on YouTube as well. For you guys want to join for the full conversation, just head on over to MeterX for a free month and you can join in and participate. What part of New Mexico? I used to live in New Mexico for quite a few years. In fact, I was just there this weekend. So what part of New Mexico? Yeah, I was in Albuquerque to see my kids or drop my kids off actually. But
awesome. I'm actually in the eastern part of the state. So down in like kind of the Clovis area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. About an hour and a half from Lubbock or so, right on the Texas border.
Okay. I lived in Lubbock, Texas. I went to medical school there actually. And I've been to Cannon Air Force Base and
that's right by you.
Yeah, there's not much there.
Honestly, the fact that you even know the general area is amazing.
Yeah, no, it's a part that not a lot of people are familiar with, but yeah, sure. So anyway, well, you are my understanding you're a dairy farmer, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you also have an interest in the environment, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So I went to school and went to school at the University of Arizona to study soil, water, and environmental science. And then I focused in policy and law and soil chemistry.
And you go by, I think your social media is, what is it, New Mexico Milkmaid or something like that?
That is what it is, New Mexico Milkmaid.
That's a good handle. I've interviewed, there's a guy named, you may be familiar with him. His name is Derek Josie. I think he's TDF or, Tillamook, what is it? Something Honest Farming or something like that. Was
yes.
it? Anyway, I interviewed him, and I've interviewed a guy named, Patrick Lucy, who's a vet who works in a dairy. He's an Irish guy, but works in an American dairy out in California. And so, run into several folks from the dairy industry, and it is a much maligned industry, much understood industry. And so it's always nice to have it. And I should have said this at the beginning, but thank you for what you do. First of all, I always like to thank the people that feed us, because I think you guys are very underappreciated, and we as a community certainly appreciate people that keep us alive by feeding us, so we don't have to do the hard work. But give us a little background. So yeah, you kind of mentioned you kind of started U of A, but where'd you grow up? Are you like a 15th generation? I'm kidding, but I mean, it seems like a lot of people they grow up under this, in this situation. So what's your background?
Yeah, so I'm a 5th generation dairy farmer. It could actually be more, but honestly, that's as far back as we had like solid confirmation. So we decided to roll with that, and 5th generation dairy farmer. My dad is actually a 1st generation here in the United States. My family's all from the Netherlands, and my family still has dairy farms in the Netherlands. And so it's just some cool, fun family history. I grew up my entire life on our family dairy in New Mexico. So New Mexico, born and raised. I left our state for a few years to go to the University of Arizona, which I absolutely loved. I did not know what I wanted to major in, was kind of all over the place. Typical small town kid, was like never going back to the dairy, not going back to the farm, like get me out of there. And 4 years later, I graduated my degree in soil, water, and environmental science, and ended up marrying the dairy farmer next door and moving back to New Mexico to dairy farm with his family and with him. And still resisted the dairy farming thing, though, for my own personal life, tried to get jobs in other fields, and everything kept pointing me back to kind of join dairy farming, but on the environmental side. So I actually started working for a company based in Santa Fe. And what we do, I've worked there now for the last 9 years, is do environmental work for dairy farms, agricultural sites. Our company does a number of different things, but with my background and my passions, it made sense for me to kind of fall into the dairy farming side of things. And so I assist dairy farmers with environmental regulations, their permitting, whether that be at state and federal levels. And then I, help them with sustainable management practices and improving their sustainability. And so that's really my area of focus. And then it's kind of branched out into a number of different things, but that's my day-to-day job.
Yeah, I want to definitely get into that. I mean, I think the dairy industry, from my understanding, there's been a decrease in sort of milk sales, but there's been an increase in other forms of dairy, as yogurts, cheeses, and stuff like that. So it's been kind of maybe even a net increase worldwide. I don't know that.
Yes.
I'm sure you know better than I do, but I think dairy milk consumption is down, but dairy consumption in general is generally up. Is that fair to say?
That is, and it can be very confusing and be misleading. And there's a lot of misleading headlines. Actually, I just saw one the other day that was like, milk consumption is down. And so if you only read that, it can feel, like what's going on? Oh, dairy's not around anymore. But dairy consumption overall is at an all-time high. We're just not drinking a glass of milk like we used to. That's just not what's happening. That's not even what's happening for me. I mean, that's not where I'm even getting my dairy nowadays. Is I'm getting my dairy from cheese and yogurts. I mean, there's a number of products out on the market. Even my traditional milk, I do drink milk in the morning, but I actually drink a product called Core Power that's ultra filtered, low sugar, high protein. So there's just so many options that don't fall into that whole milk, glass of milk category.
Yeah, and milk is just when we look at protein, dairy is a hugely, extremely effective protein source. I mean, it's, when you look at like PDCAS, protein digestibility, corrected amino acid scores, and the new one, the diases. I mean, milk is always, or dairy is always at the top of that as far as bioavailable protein goes. Now, we're in a community of meat eaters here. These are people that are eating just, meat-based diets. Some people strictly, some do dairy, some don't. Some have dairy intolerance, some do fine with that. I find that I go back and forth. Right now, this particular month, I'm just purely on nothing but red meat for World Carnivore Month. I don't know if you know about that, but that's what we're doing here. And so, but then, through the rest of the year, I'm often, I'll have some cheese and some other forms of dairy, so on and so forth. But and I don't even know, because because a lot of people are into raw dairy, and I'd like your perspective on that as a dairy person, because there's some people that think it has magical healing powers. There's other people say, hey, you got to watch out for, contamination, and it's a big issue. And some places it's legal, some places it's kind of legal if you buy it as pet dairy or something like that. What's New Mexico's laws on raw dairy? I don't know.
It is illegal in New Mexico, but yeah, every state is different. I've had kind of an interesting journey with raw milk a little bit. I drank raw milk my entire life, and so did my husband. It just was the norm of what we did. That, no other way to say it. Wasn't that we thought it had superpowers. It just was simple. We drank a ton of milk. My husband goes through, I think, just shy of a gallon every 2 days. And so it was cheaper to just go to the tank and get it ourselves, especially as kids. And I drank it all the way up until my first pregnancy. And my OBGYN was actually really forward thinking. He didn't care if I ate sushi. He was super okay with lots of different foods, soft cheeses, as long as I was making safe choices about those, making sure I was washing my hands, clean environments. And he raised a few red flags for me with the raw milk. And I ended up researching it a lot more and have kind of changed my views. I think that I don't believe in the healing powers. I think there is positive things too. The research shows there's positives for allergies of growing up on a dairy farm, and it has a lot less to do with drinking the raw milk. They've done some studies on some different Amish and different communities that drink raw milk and live on dairies and don't drink raw milk, and that research is super interesting. And I think overall, I think it's like 99% of the foodborne illnesses associated with milk come from raw milk. And so to me, it just seems like a no-brainer to just go ahead and pasteurize your milk and drink the milk. I think milk has so many amazing properties, like you said, the bioavailability of the protein, and that has nothing to do with the pasteurization. And so it just seemed like a silly risk to kind of be taking when all the benefits are still there from drinking pasteurized milk. So I guess I kind of converted my ways after doing more research and looking into it more.
Yeah, I mean, did you notice the difference? I guess my understanding is, while the majority of dairy-related infections do come from raw milk, or there's a higher propensity, the overall rate is extremely low regardless. Yeah. I mean, it's just it's very rare for anyone to get an infection from dairy, be it raw or pasteurized, right?
Great point.
Yeah.
Great point. And for me, I think that a lot of the situations I heard of for the raw milk is the classic situation on our dairy farm was my husband would take the clean bottles that I sanitized, fill them up at the dairy, and then set them on the floorboard to carry them back home. Well, what's on the floorboard? The cow manure, the dirt, the different things that he's been involved in. And so I think in a lot of cases, it has a lot less to do with the milk and a lot more, especially with our standards nowadays of sanitizing after every milking. I mean, the amount of cleanliness that goes into a dairy farm as far as the food processing side goes is unbelievable. But what happens when it leaves the tank and gets to your house and travels in the work truck? Those are the things where I think you're opening yourself up to more contaminations or something like that. So I agree with you. It has a lot less to do with the milk and just a lot of other factors.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously it's a contaminant. It's not the milk itself. And that's where the sourcing is. Let's talk about what are those things, because I mean, people talk about cows getting mastitis. Is that becoming less common, more common? Is that how do we deal with that? What do you do when that happens? It's kind of I mean, a lot of people aren't from a dairy standpoint. I think very little. Cow goes moo, you milk, and that's all they know. And I don't think they understand. There's quite a bit that goes into that, much more into that than most people understand.
Yeah, so there is a lot more. And I'll be honest, my area of expertise is not cow health. It is definitely the back end of the cow, is what I like to say, with lagoon management and soil health. But as far as mastitis goes, definitely mastitis is on the decrease. It's in our favor to make sure that cows do not get mastitis, and that our practices go into that and keeping the cow healthy. We are paid off of our milk quality, which is, a somatic cell count and a number of different things. And, there's a ton of misinformation even out there on the internet about that, but it can give us a really good indicator of how healthy the cow is. And so we want those numbers to be absolutely as low as possible, and we're paid off of that. And then obviously if a cow does get mastitis, which it does happen, if you're ever been a nursing mom, like, it happens, we treat that cow, and they are placed in what we call like our hospital pen. They're moved into a close-up pen by the barn, where we can keep better eye on them, and their milk is not put into food production. So they are milked separately, they're milked in a separate line. Everything is just completely separated, and that milk never makes it into the food supply. And there's even a withdrawal period. If they receive antibiotics, we wait until we've stopped giving them antibiotics for so many days for it to get out of their system. There's tons of checks and balances in place to make sure that that food is always separated, that milk is always separated from the main milk supply.
Yeah, and just because you mentioned somatic cell count, and a lot of people, you hear from sort of the plant-based vegan community, oh, cow milk is just filled with pus, and the somatic cells would be the cells from the actual cow as opposed to the milk. And so, can you kind of delve into that a little more for people that aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah, so it is a number of, it has nothing to do with the milk. It's about the cows, and it's about their health. And so the lower the number, the healthier the cow is. And we actually in our co-op have kind of a fun little like competition that we're awarded like $500 cash at Christmas for the 3 producers that have the lowest. So it's really, we're obviously paid on a larger scale on our milk check on it, but it is a little bit of bragging rights to make sure that your somatic cell counts are as low as possible. And it really is just about cow health. The healthier the cow, the lower those numbers are going to be. And there's a bunch of different things we test for, not just somatic cell count. There's platelet count, lots of different counts that we're keeping track of, and that all relate back to different forms of the cow health.
Yeah, and you mentioned the back end of the cow, so the manure side of it. And so one of the criticisms around, animal agriculture in general is it's just incredibly environmentally destructive. There's lots of methane production. Obviously we know the methane comes from the front end, but there is some methane that's leached out in the manure as well. And so what is being done with dairy, to improve that, or what is the actual impact? I mean, when you look at the EPA numbers in the U.S., which is where I live and where you live, I mean, it's, cattle production is something like 1.9 to 2% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's, it's obviously a small issue. It's still an issue, but it's not the 20, 30% that transportation is, like we hear in the media so much around stuff based on livestock's long shadow from 2006, which was a poorly, the study wasn't an apples to apples comparison, but anyway, I won't delve into that. But what when you say the environmental side, because talk about that, how are we improving, or what are we doing to mitigate environmental damage on the dairy side?
Yeah, so dairy is less than 2% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, like you mentioned. We actually have the lowest carbon footprint in the United States per gallon of milk in the entire world, which I think is really incredible. We are North America is the only country in the region, I guess you should say, that's actually lowered our greenhouse gas intensity overall. And so we have some really great things to be proud of in dairy. We can always do better. Like you said, it's not the massive problem that people think, but it doesn't mean we can't improve. In the last 70 years, we've reduced our carbon footprint by 66%. And in the last 10 years, we have continued on that trend by reducing it an additional 20%. And so there's some really great numbers out there as far as what dairy is doing. And we've set some huge goals for the future. So we just recently in 2020 released our goals, our sustainability goals for 2050, which is to be carbon neutral or better, as well as some goals that relate to water quality, water quantity use, and land use. And so, while I think we are on the right track, I know we can do better. And I think that these goals are really going to help us get there.
Yeah, what are some of the things that you would be incorporating to reach that sort of net carbon neutral sort of situation?
It really is all over the board of what you can do. A lot of dairies are installing digesters. There's a huge push in California for that right now. And I think that it will follow in other states. Right now in New Mexico, the technology is not quite there for digesters. So we're implementing other strategies. We have extremely sandy soil with low organic matter. And as we're learning, the healthier your soil, the more carbon you can sequester. And so for us, by applying cow manure as a natural fertilizer or as a compost, we compost our fertilizer, we can improve that soil health. We can help it have better water retention, better grow crops with less water. There's just so many areas in that soil production where there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room to sequester the soil or sequester the carbon in the soil. And so those are some of the things that we're working towards. We're also using drought resistant crops. We do not get a lot of rain. I think it's rained one time since August. It looks like headed into another drought. And so for us to really maximize our water use on our crops can be a huge point of sustainability for us. So I think it depends on the region. If you're in the Midwest, you would probably laugh about worrying about water reduction, and reducing your water use. But for us in the Southwest, that's one of our number one priorities. Whereas in the Midwest, you might be more concerned with your nutrient runoff and making sure that you're retaining those nutrients in your soil. And so it's kind of, dairy is interesting because it's so different in different parts of the country. And our goals really reflect that as far as it being, making sure you're focusing on your regional issues.
Yeah, my understanding, I think there's about 9 million dairy cows in the U.S. as opposed to I think we've got 95 head of the cattle in the entire country, including the beef, and 30 million of them end up slaughtered every year for food. Is there, and I talked to a lot of folks in the beef side, and particularly the regenerative guys who are doing the managed grazing and holistic management. There are some difficulties with, there's bottlenecks, as we saw with coronavirus, bottlenecks in the processing side. Is there something analogous to that in the dairy side, or is it in state, coming across state lines? Is there different regulations, or is it a little different than beef?
Yeah, so we experienced some issues with coronavirus when the pandemic hit as well. Our issues were more related to having to adapt to changes in how people were getting their milk. We no longer needed milk in tiny cartons to serve at schools. We no longer needed giant blocks of butter to be given to restaurants. We needed a lot more gallons of milk. Actual milk consumption has been up since coronavirus hit, with people eating at home, going back to more traditional meals, having that bowl of cereal, having that glass of milk. If you're at home, you're much more likely to do that versus if you're on the go, you might grab a yogurt or something. And so definitely we had to pivot and change things. So it wasn't as much of a bottleneck as it was difficult to change production lines that quickly. Like, you can't just in a day go from producing small individual milks that are going to go to schools to producing a lot more gallons of milk. And so in grocery stores, you saw a lot of limiting of milk sales because of people buying so much more milk. And so we really had to just kind of work through the supply chain and figure out how to keep that milk moving, because there wasn't necessarily a shortage of milk. The cows were producing the exact same amount of milk as they always had, but it was definitely just pivoting those lines and transitioning those, trucks, delivery trucks, all of those systems.
So you as a producer, do you have to change the way you do things if you know what your product's going to be used for, whether if it's just milk versus if it's going to go into yogurt or cheese production or some of the other, isolates or whatever? Is there a way you have to manage your cows differently, or you just keep milking them and they send it off and they do whatever they want with it?
Yeah, so not really. I mean, there are definitely certain dairies, like if you're a Jersey dairy, you have really high butter fat, it might go to something specific that you already know about. But ultimately, we're all trying to reach the same goals of having those low counts and different things. For us, our milk is going to cheese because we, as you mentioned, do not live in a high populated area. So for us, cheese makes the most sense because that's able to be shipped out. Also, New Mexico is one of the largest exporters of cheese to to Mexico. And so we make a ton of cheese. We actually have the world's largest cheese plant in our community, and we produce a ton of cheese. And so for us, our cheese plant is just 2 miles down the road. And so it gets there extremely quickly. We're not refrigerating for long periods of time. We're not transporting the milk for long ways. And so, we just want our milk to be absolutely the highest quality. And I think that's the case no matter what it's going to.
So you said we have the largest cheese factory in the world is in New Mexico?
Yes. Nobody ever believes me, but it's so true.
I would have thought like Wisconsin, I don't know. I mean, just, you hear that, you think of the classic cheese places. Having lived in New Mexico for, 7 or 8 years, it's not really, probably not the ideal place to graze cattle in my view. I mean, again, I think, you think you're not going to, unless you're living along the Bosque and the Rio Grande or something like that, where there's some water, but it is pretty tough. And so is it, and you touched on this a little bit about the water and that, but what are the cows? I mean, do they munching on the tumbleweeds or what are they eating out there?
They have. In some drought years, we found some really great, what people call weeds. I mean, they're not weeds, they're still plants. But no, overall, they're eating a well-balanced diet. We have nutritionists for our dairy that plans all of our cows' diet, depending on what stage of life they're in. Dry cows get a certain ration, fresh cows get a certain ration, and all the other cows, all the way from calves through adulthood get a certain ration. And that ration is a mix of all sorts of different things. And what's great about working with a nutritionist, I think, is they get really creative with what is available in your area. So cows have been eating locally long before it was even popular. You're going to feed your cows what's local to your area. And so, we don't grow as much alfalfa, so that's not going to be as high of a component in our cows' diets. But we grow a ton of cotton in our area, massive cotton production in this area. And the cotton seed is something that's left over when you produce cotton, and it can be a really great source of protein for cows. And they're able to digest it when we can't. And so that's something we incorporate into our cows' diets. And, that varies across the country what you have local to you. I know that in Florida, they feed a lot of citrus pulps and different things that comes out of citrus production. And I even know down in Las Cruces, if you're familiar with New Mexico, we produce green chili. And so sometimes leftover green chili hulls and different things that will be incorporated to the cow's diet. But really the most important thing is your nutritionist and you knowing what, proteins and different fats and carbs are available in whatever you're feeding and making sure that ration meets all of those needs.
How much, because I'm certainly with beef, the food, what they're finished on affects the flavor of the meat. Does that affect the flavor of the dairy as well? I mean, does dairy have different flavor nuances or from depending on how the cow's finished or what breed it is? I mean, you talked about butterfat content, but do these other polyphenols, I don't know if you're familiar with these guys, it's got Fred Provenza and then Stefan Van Vliet, who does a lot of research on animal nutrition and the variety. And there's, in beef, there's something like 50,000 separate chemicals that appear in the food. And I imagine milk has more than just the handful of vitamins and minerals that we talk about. But can you affect the flavor of the milk?
I'm sure you could if it was enough, but I think the ration is so complex with so many different ingredients that you would have to be really amping up a certain ingredient, I think, in order to affect it. And I know there's been some studies about that, but I think overall the consistency stays the same because of that total mixed ration that we're feeding the cows. I mean, there's so many different components. Our commodity area, I always call it a pantry when I'm talking with my followers online, because that's what it looks like. I mean, there's tons of different slots with each of them having their own ingredients that gets mixed into the cow's diet. And so I don't know, it'd be interesting. I guess you'd have to do some experimenting on if you really wanted to play with flavor. But I think the milk production overall, the consistency on taste is the same or similar.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can remember is like milk's gone bad and sour and it doesn't taste very good. But
Yeah.
other than that, milk's always tasted pretty much the same. And I guess maybe the exception, maybe some people say raw tastes a little bit different, perhaps. I don't know if that's...
Well, and raw milk, it's not only just pasteurization, but homogenization as well. And so if you're drinking raw milk and it's not homogenized as well, the cream is going to settle on the top. And so my husband will still grab a gallon of milk and shake it. just from habit from being a child, that if you didn't shake the milk, then your cream was going to end up on top. And when you poured it on your cereal, you were going to end up with what looked like thick yogurt instead of milk. And so that would obviously affect the taste depending on if you were shaking your gallon, if you were pulling the cream off the top to make butter or whatever else. And so that would definitely, I could see that with raw milk having some changes in flavor, more because of the homogenization or lack thereof.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, I was actually in South Africa, and my grandmother down there would get milk delivered in a bottle, and there would always be that, inch or two layer of cream on the top. And I thought that was just kind of, didn't really think about it, but I guess that's the difference with the homogenization, where you make everything the same, so to speak. Let's talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions or reasons why, people that, and I don't know if you have a lot of issues with activists. There's probably no activists out in Clovis because they're not big enough to a big city where they want to bother to go all the way out there. But dairy has been, in some cases, they found people that are doing the wrong things or mistreating the animals. But I mean, the general perception we hear is, the dairy farmers are very cruel to their animals, and so on and so forth. So let me ask you this. So when a calf is born, they're separated from the mother. My understanding is because cows are not particularly good mothers. They tend to sometimes injure their own animals. Sometimes I think the colostrum is, I don't know. Can you talk about calving and how that, and what is the rationale behind initially separating the mother from the calf?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on some great points. There's a lot of different breeds of cattle. Beef cattle are not the same as dairy cattle. They're very different. Beef cattle are much, larger, heavier. Dairy cattle are slimmer, fit. I mean, the differences are visible and go so much beyond that. And one of them is dairy cattle tend to not make great mothers. Like it's a very common thing. They will give birth and almost immediately walk away from the calf, go eat. It just is something that has not been bred into them, like cattle, like beef cattle that are out on pasture or something, and have to have those motherly instincts. And so a lot of it goes back to the health of the calf and the health of the mother by separating them. The calf still receives colostrum, which is extremely important. It's one of the most important things when that calf is first born. Within the first few hours of life, it needs to get colostrum. And so we do milk our fresh cows, is what they're called when they first calve, to get that colostrum and give it to the calves. All of our calves on our dairy are going to receive that colostrum, whether they're male or female. I know there's misconceptions around that. And then ultimately we bottle feed each of our calves individually in individual hutches for the first couple of months when they're kind of getting their legs under them, just getting started. You want to make sure that their immune system is really healthy. They receive warm bottles all throughout the day, as well as fresh grain and water. And then they're ultimately moved into a group pen. It's kind of funny. I always refer to the group pen as like kindergarten. Like you can tell they're like ready to play with each other. And by then you've established their immune system. So they're, when they're calves, if they're all licking each other, if one gets sick, they're all going to get sick. And so by that 2-3 months, when they move to that group pen, they have a much more established immune system from that colostrum, from that milk, that really helps them off to a really great start. I mean, the calves are the future of our herd, and it takes 2 years from the time they're born till they join our milking herd. So it's a huge investment in keeping them really healthy and making sure they get off to that great start in those 2 years.
Yeah. So and I guess they're drinking milk initially, and then they're switched on to whatever feed they're going to get, the ration or the grazing, I assume. Is that how what's a cow's diet like, calf's diet like for the first?
Yes. So initially it's primarily milk, although they have access to water. Then the grain is introduced slowly. There's so much research out there. We work with our vets on exactly the timing of giving them these different things and how much milk versus how much grain, to make sure that, they have 4 compartments in their stomach. So you want to make sure you develop each of those stomachs correctly, and that everything has to be just balanced, just right as far as their diet goes. And then ultimately they're weaned at about 3 months and fed their ration then that is going to help them grow in that, from infancy to adulthood.
One of the I guess the big concerns is, you're on a dairy farm. I mean, I guess the older cows often sometimes get into the beef production, when they're no longer able to be milked. And I don't know what that's 6, 7, 8 years in. I don't know, depending on the cow. I guess you have better numbers than I would on that. One of the concerns is, the males. We always hear about the male cows, and they're cruelly treated or something like that. I think, isn't there, I mean, my understanding is, you know, at some point, the ability to select the sex has also come along a ways, where you can actually decrease the number of males that are born and preference females based on, you know, the way the artificial insemination is done. What's the fate of the males?
Yeah, so I know you talked with Derek Josie a little bit about this. I listened to the podcast with him about the sex semen. So originally when sex semen came out, everyone jumped on that, and there was only, you know, I think it's 9 out of 10 that are born female. And it created a little bit of a supply and demand problem, because dairies were able to expand a lot faster, even if demand wasn't there. And we've kind of since learned from our mistakes and adjusted things. And so one of the things we're doing on our dairy, and I know a lot of people are doing in our area, we are actually only like 45 minutes from Hereford, Texas, which is the beef capital of the world, or that's the claim. And so for our male calves, they almost always, they go to beef. We don't have a lot of veal operations around here, so they're raised up to beef. And we have actually been crossbreeding. So we do use sex semen for our dairy cows that we want to breed, and for the genetics we want to keep in our herd. And for other cows, we are crossing to Angus crosses, which is traits obviously better suited for beef cattle. Again, those changes in those breeds. And so it's a cross then between half Angus, half Holstein. And then that really helps with that beef production. Those male calves, or those calves that are crosses, are much more desirable for beef production than maybe their Holstein steer counterparts. And so that's some of the ways that we've improved, I think, as far as some of our breeding to female versus male cows. But ultimately, in our area, no matter whether they're crosses or Holsteins, the males are raised for beef production.
Yeah. So, and like I said, when you talk about veal, I mean, my understanding with veal, even veal is still a 500-600 pound animal, yes, you know, typically, unless there's something called bobby beef, which is the real small one, which is pretty rare. But I think even the veal is a relatively developed animal. It's not like a baby. It's not like it's an infant calf.
Yes, it's very different than what people think. And they also adhere to strict guidelines, have vets and nutritionists that manage the veal's diets as well. So the misconceptions around veal are also vast. I do not claim to be a veal expert at all, but there is a ton of misconceptions around there. It's a 600-pound animal by the time it's butchered. And so definitely not the calf that I feel like activists like to portray as the veal animal, and not in, you know, small crates and confined, and not bad diets. You know, they're tested for their levels of anemia, making sure that they're healthy and they're getting enough iron. I mean, they really are watching that cow's health extremely closely.
Yeah, and I guess, like I said, there's what was Derek said, ask a farmer, not an activist, because
Yes,
you guys are actually dealing with this stuff day to day, and these guys are getting their information from the Disney Channel or something. I don't know where they get it from, but it's you know, I mean, obviously, like I said, there's always bad examples, and I think people sort of see a bad example and assume that's the industry standard. And I think even as a rancher or as a dairy farmer, you see someone mistreating an animal, I'm sure you think that's not good either. I mean, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched some of the activist videos just along with everyone else, and I've had to shut them off. My husband's had to shut them off. If it makes us that physically sick, I would say it's an indicator that it is not representative of the dairy community as a whole throughout the nation, and that we hold ourselves to extremely high standards. Our co-ops hold us to really high standards, and we're people. I'd like to remind people of that. We didn't go into dairy farming to get rich quick scheme. You know, we genuinely care about our animals and there are livelihoods. I mean, we talk about that with our daughters regularly. When we're eating beef, we butcher our own cattle, eat our own beef cattle. And we talk about it. This came from our dairy. We raised this calf. We bottle fed this calf, and now they're providing nutrients for us. And I think that's an extremely important part of our livelihoods.
What do the cows prefer to do? I mean, I know there's people that tell you that the cow wants to roam free and play in the woods and that sort of stuff, but it seems like when it's cold outside, they like being indoors, just like you and I do. So we have this perception that we know what the cow wants, or I speak for the animals type of stuff. But when the animals get to decide what they want to do, what do they like to do?
The other day it was like a 55-degree winter December day, like sunny and beautiful. And we drove through our dairy, and we have open lot dairies, which is maybe not what most people have seen. So I'll give a little bit of background on that. Ours are open corrals, essentially, where the cows can all feed in what's called the hay alley. They have big shades, windbreak. So our cows are outdoors year round. In New Mexico, we have fairly mild climate. It's sunny most days, and so we get very little rain. There's just not a lot of weather. And so our cows are outdoors, and we drove by our pens, and there was cows just sprawled everywhere in the back of the pen, relaxing, chewing their cud, that classic, like where they're sprawled out sleeping, almost snoring. You can almost just feel them just like so relaxed. And I felt like that was the epitome of a dairy cow enjoying her life, was chewing her cud, relaxing in the back of the pen, just hanging out. And that is the majority of what they're doing. I mean, they're only in a milking barn twice a day for about 8 minutes each time. And the rest of their day is just hanging out in their pen.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is something I know there's some technology exists where the cows can kind of milk at their convenience. There's I guess there's automation where they can just kind of come into the pen when they want to, and it automatically does it. So whenever they feel like they need to be milked, they get milked. Is that something you guys know about or utilize, or what's the story on that?
So we do know about that, and that's been around actually in Europe for a really long time. And so the times I visited my family's dairies in the Netherlands, actually the first time I think I was only in like fourth grade, and we got to see robotic milking there. So they're way ahead of us in Europe on that trend. But it has come to the United States. It's becoming more popular actually in the Midwest right now. It's a great option, I think, right now for what's called freestall barns, where the calves are on like sand bedding. They're inside of a barn because of obviously the extreme weather that can happen in the Midwest. For us out here, it's not as feasible yet. We've actually talked with one of the robotic milking machine companies about, what would it take to install one of these on our dairy, and what would we have to change? And with the open lot dairy, it definitely we would have to work through some things. And so I don't think we're there yet. And the cost benefit right now is just not there for us. But I think it's something that I'm excited about for the future. I'm excited to see. It's probably up there for me on technologies as far as like, what's going to happen with digesters and those kind of things. They're emerging technologies, and I think there's a lot of prospect for the future for them. But for us at this moment, we're not there yet.
Yeah, and I think, and speaking of the Midwest, my former podcast host of mine, Zach Bitter, who's a ultra marathon runner, he's got the world record for 100-mile runs and so on and so forth. He grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin, and was talking about the dairies that were doing that, where, like you said, now, like I said, you said your family was really from the Netherlands, and that part of the world, and I'll go up to Scandinavia, is a big dairy part of the world. And we see some of the tallest people in the world, and there's been a link between dairy and population height. And by the way, most of those folks live pretty long. Most of the Scandinavian and people in the Netherlands have a pretty long life expectancy. What is your thoughts on dairy being a health food?
I'm not biased at all, but I obviously think it's a superfood. I genuinely believe that. We've been drinking it or incorporating it into our diet in various ways, whether it's drinking milk or having cheeses that we could carry with us for journeys, for centuries, and so thousands and thousands of years that we're seeing that dairy's been a part of our diets. And so I do think that it needs to be a staple in our diets. I know there is a study in Canada where they looked at the height of children drinking alternative plant-based milks versus milks, and they were shorter of stature. And not that that's like the end all be all. I'm 5'1", so I'm not exactly breaking any world records. But I actually have a daughter who has a genetic disorder, and one of the things is low weight, low height. And we have just gotten her on the growth charts, and it has been by pushing really like great smoothies for after meal snack that we incorporate milk and yogurt with fruits and vegetables. And it's amazing to see, she already was eating dairy, but just by pushing like that one extra serving, I really think has made the difference. And so have her doctors. And so I know I see the benefit from it in my family and my kids and in studies and so much beyond just our family that I believe in it and believe that it's bioavailable protein as a mom with kids, it is the easiest way to get my kids to eat more vegetables and fruits by incorporating milk. And I know this is a carnivore conversation, but if I add yogurt to their fruit, they're going to eat more fruit. If I add a little cheese on top of their salad, they're much more likely to eat it. And so I really think that not only is it a staple, but it can also be such a part of a healthier diet overall. Is kind of, I guess, my views. But like I said, not biased at all.
Yeah, I get that. Hey, how many head of cattle, or how many animals do you have?
Yeah, so I saw that question pop up. So the dairy that I live on actually milks just under 2,000 cows, and that is going to seem like, I know, a massive number to a lot of people, but New Mexico is really unique in our dairy industry. We have the largest average herd size in the United States. So our average herd size is about 2,200, and it really has to do with these open lot style dairies, our warm climates. We don't have to house all of our cows in barns, and so we have dry climate, which cows really love when they're outside, is for it to be dry. And so that all of those factors play into our larger herd size. And so our dairy is pretty much average with the rest of the dairies in New Mexico.
And just, and I always like to put this in perspective, and I'm sure you probably know the stats on this, but if we look at like wild ruminant animals, and there's a good study at the University of Pennsylvania looking at the white-tailed deer population, something like 50% of those animals do not reach 12 weeks of age. They're killed through predation, starvation, freezing to death, whatever. What is your survival rate on a dairy cow? Like, how many of your calves make it to adulthood?
Yeah, I don't have the exact statistics. I'd have to actually ask my husband. That's his area of focus. But it is extremely low. We were reading an article recently that was about a hospital, and my husband was like, my death rate or death loss, however you want to look at it, is lower than that. Like, it is extremely low. And that's something we work towards. If that number increases by even one calf or a couple of calves, it is like all hands on deck. What is happening? What got changed? Are we getting some kind of virus that's going through? Did something change in their ration? Because you will open up a new bag. We bag all of our crops that we cut. And so you'll be like, is something wrong with that crop? And start testing things like crazy and going through every single piece. Did something not get sanitized right in the calving barn? I mean, it's crazy the amount of information overload goes into figuring out why something like that changed. Why would we lose a couple of calves when we normally don't? And so that there's so much science. If you take anything away from this conversation, I think is that there's so much science that goes into every piece of our dairy farm, and so much information that we use in data collection of figuring out exactly how we can best support our cows.
Yeah, my understanding is it's something 1% to maybe 3% death rate.
Yes.
Compare, like I said, when you're comparing a 50% death rate to a natural wild animal. So Dee's, and I think Dee maybe does some dairy stuff too, but she's asking about a rotary parlor, and maybe you could explain what that is, and do you use it?
Yeah, so rotary parlors are a newer style, new-ish. They've been around a while, but they're really gaining popularity. And it's where a cow basically, they're also called carousels. It's a cow gets on what looks like a giant carousel. And at first, they're a little nervous from what I've heard about doing the carousels, but once they get used to it, they love it. And so the cow goes around in a giant circle. There's like a slot all the way around the circle, and they're milked while they're on that, and then they step off of the carousel. We currently don't have those. We built our barns in the early 90s, and it wasn't as popular then. But pretty much if you're building a dairy right now, you would probably install a carousel dairy. They're extremely efficient, and it's really cool. If you ever get a chance to check out a carousel, if anyone's in the Midwest, I know Fair Oaks Farms uses carousels that you can go see. It's really something to see. We actually have a herringbone style barn, and so the cows are what looks like on a herringbone, kind of at an angle. There's also parallels. There's a ton of different style of barns that really is just about your preference. And the cows, like I said, the first time a cow uses a new barn, they're kind of like, okay, what's the situation here? How are we supposed to go in? And cows are amazing creatures of habit, though. Once they do something pretty much twice, that's it. They've got it down, and they want it to stay exactly the same the rest of the time.
Yeah, I think I've actually been to that Fair Oaks farm. I think it's in Indiana. My father lived not far from there. I think they unfortunately were shown to be having issues with handling the animals, and so they've had a lot of legal issue with that. So that's been something that came up recently in the last couple of years, I believe. What is the so you said you have 2,000 head of cattle. The average size is about 2,000 in New Mexico. Is that nationwide or is that specific to New Mexico? Because I think the
Specific
average.
to New Mexico. The
What's an
average herd size, I think, is much smaller than that. I think it might be like 120. It varies, I know, from year to year, and it is on the increase, but I think it's just over 100 is the average herd size nationwide.
what kind of, you said you had Holstein cows. Is that
Correct. We
and
have
then
Holstein cows. They handle our climate really well, especially in the open lots. I know there's a couple Jersey dairies around us, but primarily we are definitely in a Holstein area.
yeah, so Holsteins and Jersey are the main dairy cattle I've ever heard of. So I'm sure there's probably a few others. I
Yeah,
would
I think
imagine.
there's like 8 or 9 technically main ones. There's Guernseys, but yes, Holsteins are number one, and then Jerseys shortly behind that.
Do you see, well, in New Mexico, I mean, are there any differences in New Mexico versus other states as far as legal incentives or disincentives as far as as far as being a dairy farmer?
So from an environmental perspective, New Mexico is heavily regulated on groundwater. And so that is obviously my area of focus. We have groundwater monitoring wells around our dairy that we track groundwater quality and making sure. So one of the things about a dairy is we recycle a gallon of water about 5 times. So we'll use the gallon of water the first time to cool the milk. Then we'll use it to wash down the equipment in the front of the barn. Then we can use it to flush the back of the barn, any like manure that has collected where the cows are standing while they're waiting to be milked. And then we can flush their where they stand like to eat their food behind the food. We can flush that because that collects the most amount of manure. And then we ultimately collect that along with any rainwater in our lagoons, and we apply that water out onto our fields. And so we want to make sure we are applying that water that's collected, that manure and those nutrients along the way at agronomic rates. So we want to make sure that we're giving the crop exactly what it needs when it needs it and not over applying. And so by checking groundwater, that's one of the ways we can monitor that. Like, did we over apply? Are we going to see anything in the water? And even before that, we sample our soil down to 3 feet to see what nutrients are available in our soil and making sure that nothing's traveling down through the soil profile that shouldn't be. We want everything, all those nutrients collected by the crop. And so those regulations vary widely per region. It really depends. Some people are more focused on surface water, groundwater, soils. It just depends where you're located.
And I don't know if I got this information out from you earlier, maybe apologize if I did, but crossing state lines with dairy, is there any extra hoops you have to do? I mean, with beef you do, with dairy, I don't know if there is.
Yeah, so I actually serve on our New Mexico State Livestock Board. And so dairy falls under a lot of the same regulations as beef as far as crossing animals. We're going to be testing them for different diseases before they cross. Some states don't have, certain cattle diseases that other states may. And so you're testing them for all sorts of different things like that. And so it's definitely similar to beef in that way. It's still it's still a cattle. And so you're going to be checking them as they cross state lines. And then as far as the milk production goes, if you're crossing state lines, there's going to be certain regulations. Milk stays closer now than it used to. We have some new agreements between co-ops where we try not to have like trucks passing each other on the road to get to plants. And so your milk is staying a lot closer than it used to. I know when I was a kid, I remembered the Southeast was really milk deficient, and we would have to send milk trucks down to Florida, which is a really long way to haul a perishable liquid product. And that is just not as common as it used to be.
What has been the impact of the plant-based, I hesitate to call them milks, plant-based beverages, oats and soy and almond and stuff like that? Has that made a big damper into your business from what you can see? Has there been any inroads? I mean, you go to the grocery store and you see many of them, they have a pretty generous supply of that stuff, and I totally ignore that stuff and don't have any desire to drink that stuff. But what has been the impact on the dairy industry with the so-called plant, quote unquote, milks?
So if you were to listen to activists or media, it's had a huge impact, and that is actually not true. The biggest impact we've had on people drinking less whole milk is actually bottled water. Bottled water has had the biggest impact on the decrease in milk consumption. Whole or milk products are still in 98% of households. Most people that choose a plant-based beverage are also choosing milks. A lot of times it's about variety and a lot less about one or over the other. If you have someone that's watching their weight and they're trying to be low in calories, they might pick an almond milk, which, as we know, has very little protein but is lower in calories. And so really what's hurt us the most is bottled water, which I think it surprises a lot of people initially, but then when you really think about it, that's what people are choosing to drink is more bottled water.
Yeah, I guess from a caloric standpoint, and what is the we've had when I was a kid, I drank, I literally drank a gallon of milk a day. I'm 6'5", so I mean maybe that had something to do with it. I literally drank a gallon of milk almost every day, and enough to where it pissed my parents off because I was always drinking all the milk, and it was skim milk, back in the day. Because I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm 50, about to turn 54 next week, and so that was the sort of thing. And now, at least in some communities, they're seeing the benefits of full fat dairy. Are you seeing what has been the sort of overall economic picture for skim versus whole fat milk?
Yeah, so the research is overwhelmingly pointing towards whole fat milk as actually being healthy, helping with keeping weight down. You feel full longer with the fats. As far as kids and brain development, the fats are a superfood. You want those fats in helping developing brains. I think that we just came out with our new, dietary guidelines for the next 5 years. They're still lagging a little bit behind. They're still saying low fat or no fat milk, but that's pretty common, I think, with our dietary guidelines, is lagging a little bit behind the scientific evidence. But I think it was Time magazine a while back that had the cover, and it was butter is back. Butter is back, whole fat is back. We're just realizing so much more kind of our missteps, I think, in dietary guidelines in the past, that fats in things like milk are not the enemy. And I'm happy to see that back. As a dairy farmer, I'm obviously happy to see that back. I think we need to start getting it back in schools. Kids are so much less likely to drink milk when it's skimmed milk. But we know that kids that drink milk, even if it's flavored, are less likely to pick soda pop and end up with lower sugar contents in their diet. And so I think we're headed in the right direction. I wish we'd pick up steam a little bit as far as the full fat goes, because I think overall it would benefit mainly our children, but everybody, I think society as a whole, in our nutritional diets.
I think by saying the dietary guideline is lagging is a very generous. So I'm quite honest, I think they're just dead wrong in a lot of cases, but that's obviously a bone of contention there.
Agreed.
Yeah. So let me, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, so we know that like the average cattle rancher in the United States is 63 years of age. Is that the same phenomenon in the dairy industry? Is it mostly the older generation? Are we seeing some younger, obviously you're much younger than that. Are you seeing some younger folks that are taking an interest in dairy, or where do you see the future of dairy and cattle over the next, couple decades?
That's such a good question, and such an important question for the future of our food system. We are experiencing the same thing in dairy with older generations. It's really hard to attract kids back to the farm, so to speak. The cost of initial investment is absolutely astronomical. Like our milk check price hasn't changed much since the 80s, but every other component has increased. This is obviously one of the reasons we're seeing larger farms, is so that we can have a little bit easier time, buying in bulk and improving our margins. Families are also like sticking together. Like my dad, when he hit 30, went out on his own. I'm 32. We're still in partnership with my husband's parents and his brothers. There's I guess what would it be, 6 families that are supported as ownership of our dairy. And then from there, so many employees. Our herdsman on the dairy I live on has been with us 30 years. And so it really, those are the challenges we face, though, is that moving on to like the next generation is not always financially feasible for farms right now. Just the cost of things has just skyrocketed. But I think that one of the ways, I mean, I was one of those kids, I didn't want to come back to the farm. I said that right at the beginning. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I ended up finding out when I left how passionate I'm about it. But I think we can attract more young people by sharing with people about the technology of it. I think a lot of people still imagine a dairy farm like my grandfather milked on in Netherlands, right? On a 3-stool wooden peg. And that's not the case now. There's just such cool technology out there and innovation. And if that excites you at all, I hope we can attract more young people in that way of coming back and finding out that, you know, if you're into genetics, come to a dairy farm. Our genetics program is crazy, looking at, you know, all the different traits of dairy cattle. If you're into nutrition, like become a dairy cattle nutritionist. You know, there's so many cool aspects of dairy farming that didn't exist. My job didn't exist probably 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You didn't have an environmental scientist hired on at the dairy to do regulations. And I remember graduating from college and people asked me what I was going to do. Like they didn't understand where I was going to get a job. And I was the first person out of college, out of my friends, that had a job. And so I think that I hope that's how we attract them, is through our universities and our trade programs at trade schools and different things, and get more young people excited about what food production can mean, not just dairy, but food production, agriculture in general.
Yeah, I know for me, just for my own personal reason, I want to have some cows, so I'll have a steady food supply later on in life. Maybe when I retire, I'll have my own little ranch, and maybe we'll do some milking. Who knows if you can do it on a small scale, just to support yourself, like a homestead type of situation. I don't know if you're aware of a guy named Frank Mitloner. He's at UC Davis. He's a professor, talks about a lot of the environmental sides, particularly the greenhouse gas sides. But he talked about the genetics and the productivity of the U.S. cows versus, you know, like say cows in India, where it takes them, 20 years to produce the same amount of milk our cow would produce in 1 year. I mean, is that how big of a difference does the technology and genetics make for, you know, minimizing how many animals you need and so on and so forth?
Absolutely. I mean, our milk production and our cow numbers, I think, are a great indicator of that. Our cow numbers are steady or barely rising, and our milk production has increased greatly. Our cows produce about 80 pounds of milk per day. On average, it varies. It can be down to 75, you know, but if you have a dairy cow that's only producing 20 pounds of milk, then there's a huge, you know, gap there as far as what other countries are able to produce. And obviously that's where a lot of our numbers for sustainability have come from, is improving those. And a lot of that simply goes back to improved cow health. Our diets for our cows are better. Just how we care for them has changed. You know, when you see these activist videos and things, I want to tell them, I can promise you cow care has never been better than what it is now, and it's proof. If a cow is healthier, she's going to produce more milk. And so I think that there is a huge gap there between what our technology is allowing available to us and what other countries are having available. Last year, I know I attended the UN Food and Agriculture Organization Committee on World Food Security, and I talked with dairy farmers from, you know, African countries and other countries across the world about the challenges they face. And a lot of it is the lack of technology, a lack of availability of different programs and things. And so, you know, that's a whole giant topic, but there is definitely a huge gap there.
Yeah, and so just for my edification, so how, like, you milk the cows twice a day, typically, what is the the lifespan of a dairy cow? You know, how long is she milking? Is there a period of time where she's not milking? You know, what does their year look like, or 2-year cycle look like?
Yeah, so they, the first time they calve, they're about 2 years old, and their lifespan really depends on a number of different things: their health, their production. Ultimately, if production falls below like the cost of keeping that animal alive, feeding them, they're going to go for beef. That is a part of our life cycle on our dairy farm. But we have cows that have had 13 lactations. So we don't necessarily count it in years. It's more of lactations is how we calculate. And lactations means how many calves they've had. And so it varies depending on the cow. I think 6 might be the average. I'll have to look. That's actually a really good question. I'll have to look at our records and see what the average is. But a normal cow is pregnant for about 9 months. The last 2 months of her pregnancy, 2 to 3 months of her pregnancy, we dry her off is what we call. So we stop milking her, and she's moved to a dry cow pen where her only job is simply to eat, drink, and grow the calf. When she calves, then she will enter the milk cycle again, the milking herd again. She'll be a fresh cow at first, and then she'll move in with the rest of the herd population. And our pens are divided up based on what lactation they're on, how old they are, if they've ever, like, say, sprained their ankle or something like that, they're going to be moved to a pen much closer, as close to the barn as they can get, so they have less to walk. The younger cows tend to be in the back of the pen so that they are, the healthy young ones can walk a little further. I mean, it's not a huge difference in walking, but we try to have the older cows, the further lactation cows, up close to the barn. And so, yeah, that's kind of, I guess, the general cycle of how they kind of move around the dairy and move through, the milking herd and dry cows. Another term you might hear is heifers. Heifers are cows that haven't had a calf yet. So they're young cows under the age of 2. So yeah, there's a lot of different cows at different stages of life on our dairy farm.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So they're able to produce and to be milked while they're in the early stages of pregnancy, which I guess I think humans, from my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not an obstetrician, but I don't think humans can do that very well. I don't think you can.
They can. It is, I think, more difficult. Typically, I think the recommendation is to dry up. If you're a woman and you have 2 kids close together, to dry up before and give yourself a break. I know that there are women who have milked straight through and nursed straight through. I guess milked is the wrong word, nursed straight through. But it's much more common with cows to continue milking in the early stages of pregnancy. And then we do not breed them again. So when they first get back in the milking string, you don't breed them right away. You want them to just be milking again for, about 2 months. It may take them a little longer. That's one of the interesting things about AI. A lot of artificial insemination gets hated on by activists. But if you have bulls, the bulls will start to breed cows immediately after, if they're able, they'll breed them as soon as they can when they start their cycle again, which can often be too soon and really damaging to the cow, or it just depends. And so one of the great things about AI is having full control over when we decide to breed them again and making sure they're ready, making sure that they've, healed from delivery, that they're in good health, that they've just recovered from having a calf. And so that, I think, is one of the positives there.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is bulls they're not candlelight and wine dinners. I mean, they tend to be rough, and there can be some bulling injuries where the cows actually get injured by traditional, reproduction of the animals. Is that
correct? And you can't control which bull is going to breed which cow. So if you have a smaller heifer and a giant bull, yeah, it can be really damaging. AI takes that risk out. Bulls, my dad, I know when I was a kid, had a bull ram his truck. Like, he was parked in the pen checking on cows, and the bull just ram straight in. Like, they're not exactly nice. We don't have bulls on our dairy, so I don't have to deal with it as much with my girls. But growing up, bull safety was a huge part of like what we had to be taught, because if you got in a pen with a mean bull, it could injure you, it could kill you, it could do damage to your vehicles, damage to the pens. And so, yeah, bull safety is something that is a huge topic on dairies with bulls.
Yeah, somebody just had a question about the meat quality that Holsteins produce. I imagine, if they're not putting nice steaks out, they're gonna be hamburger based. So they probably go into the ground beef production generally, would be my guess.
So there's been some study on that, actually. There are some restaurants that only serve Holstein steaks, and they claim it's because the higher quality and taste. And one of the arguments for that is that dairy cows have been fed a consistent diet their entire lives, well balanced. Nothing has ever changed. They've never had to forage for their food. And so I think it would be interesting. I've never done a taste test, but I would be interested to do that and see. Obviously, yeah, the marbling would be different. How they're finished would be different. But so Typically, though, Holsteins, yes, end up as your hamburger meat and other things. But there are those who disagree and say that it's all marketing.
Interesting. Well, hey, I tell you, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been very informative. Where can people go to find out more about what you do, the name of your ranch, your social media, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so you mentioned at the beginning, I do share online about the sustainability and environmental side of dairy farming, as well as just our everyday life on our farm with our girls. And you can find me at New Mexico Milkmaid on Instagram as well as Facebook. If you're on Twitter, I'm not super big on Twitter at all, but I'm NM Milkmaid. And then my website is newmexicomilkmaid.com. And if you guys have questions or anything that's something that we didn't get to, I always answer my DMs in my Instagram, so send them there.
Can people come out and visit you out on if they decide they want to drive way out in the middle of nowhere to visit
We do tours occasionally for our local community and our air base, as you mentioned, but we don't do public tours right now. I don't think we'd have enough interest, to be honest. If we had people that could regularly visit New Mexico, that'd be one thing, but we just don't have the big enough population to have an ongoing tour.
Yeah, I mean, if outside of Santa Fe and Albuquerque, that's where everybody lives. But I mean, like I said, you're in a pretty remote part of a pretty not very populated state. So
exactly.
Anyway, well, thank you so much. You have a great day. And can people? Your dairy, does it show up as a brand, or does it? How do we get your dairy? Like, how do we know?
Our dairy doesn't really have anything. I do everything for it through the social media account, New Mexico Milkmaid. I don't know what made us decide to do that, but that was just kind of how we ended up branding it, was just New Mexico Milkmaid. So that's our dairy, and that's where you can find us.
Well, good luck to you, and thank you for doing this, and look forward to seeing you down the road. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending and all your great questions. I had a lot of fun today. Thank you.
Okay. Have a great one. Bye-bye, guys. See you guys tomorrow.